They said there was always food left on the Whitlocks' table. Biscuits gone cold, sweet cream congealed, plates never cleared, because Mistress Margaret believed a lady's house should always look full, even when it was starving. Her daughter, Sarah, learned early what hunger really meant. Not the kind that gnaws at your stomach, but the kind that settles into your heart when the people who feed you also teach you to hate yourself for being hungry. By the time she was 8, the servants had stopped whispering her name. They simply called her the child upstairs and crossed themselves whenever they heard the floorboards creak at night. They say her mother fed her to shame itself, one spoonful at a time. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back to Mississippi, 1857. Morning light came slow over Rosefield Plantation, golden streaks turning the drifting dust to glitter. The dining room sat still, too still, save for the faint clink of a silver spoon against porcelain. Sarah and Whitlock sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, her small feet not quite reaching the floor. Her mother, Mistress Margaret, sat at the head, spine perfectly straight, her coffee untouched. Between them lay plates of food, eggs going cold, biscuits left whole. The air thick with butter and silence. "Take another, Sarah Ann," Margaret said softly. Her voice was sweet and poisonous, the kind that left no room for disobedience. Sarah Ann obeyed. She lifted her fork with trembling fingers and pushed a cold bite of egg into her mouth, chewing quietly, eyes lowered, her face flushed pink with the effort. "Not so fast," her mother warned. "You'll make yourself sick again." The girl swallowed hard, feeling her mother's gaze press down on her throat like a hand. In the far corner of the room, Hetty, the young servant girl, stood barefoot and silent, told not to move unless summoned. But her wide, dark eyes followed Sarah Ann's every motion. Margaret dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, though it was already spotless. "You know, I saw Mrs. Beaumont's daughter at church yesterday. Elise has grown so beautifully, graceful, polite, so very mindful of herself." She let the words hang in the air like perfume. Sarah Ann kept her eyes fixed on her plate. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words always felt wrong when she tried to shape them. Margaret sighed. "When I was your age, my mother never had to remind me how to sit or how much to eat. I wanted to please her. Don't you want to please me, Sarah Ann?" The question hung in the air like smoke. "Yes, ma'am," the child whispered. "Then do better." From the doorway, Hetty shifted, the sound so faint it was almost nothing. But Margaret's eyes cut toward her like a blade. "And you," she said sharply, "wipe that table. There's dust gathering where it shouldn't be." "Yes, ma'am," Hetty whispered, head down, the rag trembling in her hands. Sarah Ann's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered against the plate. The noise made her flinch. Her mother's lips tightened, but she said nothing. She simply rose, the rustle of her black skirts the only sound left in the room. When Margaret finally left, the silence returned like a held breath being released. Hetty moved closer, her eyes soft. "You want me to take your plate, Miss Sarah?" Sarah Ann shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama don't like when I waste." She looked down at the cold food, the yolks of the eggs turning gray in the morning light, and picked up her fork again. Outside, the magnolias were blooming. Inside, the air smelled like shame. By late morning, the house filled with the sounds Margaret loved best. The faint tap of shoes on polished floors, the soft hum of a maid dusting the parlor, the ticking of the French clock on the mantel. She sat by the window with a needle and thread, stitching lace into a dress that wasn't hers, pausing every few minutes to glance at her reflection in the glass and smooth a stray curl back into place. Margaret Whitlock was a woman who lived by reflections, what others saw, what others said, what others envied. In Rosefield's quiet rooms, reputation was worth more than love. Her hands moved quickly through the white fabric as her thoughts drifted to Mrs. Clara Beaumont. Clara's home was smaller and her husband poorer, but she was the kind of woman people called charming, always a laugh ready, always something sweet to say. Her daughter, Elise, had grown into a dainty little thing that made Margaret's stomach twist with envy. At the last Sunday service, Clara had leaned over and whispered, "Sarah and must be growing fast. She's such a strong little girl." Margaret knew exactly what that word meant. Strong. It meant heavy, unfeminine. A disappointment dressed up in politeness. She had smiled anyway, thin-lipped and brittle, and said, "She takes after her father." Now, sitting by the window, the word kept echoing back to her. Strong. Hetty entered carrying a tray of folded linens and stopped just short of the doorway, lowering her eyes. "Where's Sarah Ann?" Margaret asked, her voice cool. "In her room, ma'am," Hetty murmured. "Miss Sarah said she don't feel well." Margaret's needle paused mid-stitch. "Not feel well?" she repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "Tell her to come down. I don't abide weakness in this house." "Yes, ma'am." When Hetty left, Margaret turned back to the window. Outside, the magnolia tree gleamed white beneath the noon sun. For a moment she thought she saw a shadow move beneath it, a small, round shape sitting in the dirt. Her heart skipped, but when she blinked, there was nothing there, only petals falling. She pressed a hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe. Sarah Ann arrived a few minutes later, still in her nightdress, curls tangled, face flushed. Margaret didn't look up. "You forgot your manners again," she said calmly. "You should always greet your mother before entering a room." "Good morning, Mama," the child said softly. "Good afternoon," Margaret corrected. "You've slept the day away." Sarah Ann's stomach rumbled, loud enough to make her wince. Margaret's eyes flicked up, cold amusement flickering in them. "You see? Even your stomach's unladylike." Sarah Ann lowered her gaze, pressing her palms against her middle. "Go wash. I'll be having tea with Mrs. Beaumont this evening, and I'd like you to sit with us. Quietly, of course. Perhaps you'll learn something." "Yes, ma'am." As Sarah Ann turned to leave, Margaret called after her, "Wear the blue dress. It hides more of you." Thomas Whitlock came home when the sun hung low, that hour when the sky turned the color of whiskey and the air smelled faintly of dust and tobacco. The fields had gone quiet. The workday was done. He liked that quiet. He liked most things quiet. He stepped through the back door, wiping his boots before crossing into the hall. From the parlor came his wife's voice, low and measured, each word sharpened like glass. She was entertaining Mrs. Beaumont again. He hung his hat on the rack and stood a moment, listening. "Children reflect their mothers," Margaret was saying. "A girl who lacks discipline grows into a woman who embarrasses herself. I'm determined to prevent that." Clara Beaumont's syrupy laugh followed. "Of course, dear. It's a mother's duty to shape what God gives us, though some children are harder to shape than others." Something tightened behind Thomas's ribs. He could picture them both. Margaret upright and perfect, Clara leaning forward with her false kindness. He thought of Sarah and upstairs, likely sitting in her little chair with her hands folded, trying to disappear into the air. He climbed the stairwell, his boots silent on the wood. From the landing he could see soft, flickering light spilling from Sarah Ann's room. He found her at her vanity, her round face glowing in the lamplight. The blue dress her mother had chosen was a size too small, its buttons straining at the seams. She was trying to brush her hair but kept stopping to wipe her eyes. When she saw him, she froze. "Evening, Papa." Thomas smiled faintly. "You look fine, Sarah." She shook her head. "Mama says I look wrong." He hesitated, then sat on the edge of her bed. "Your mama says a lot of things." Sarah's lip trembled. "Am I bad?" The question hung in the air like smoke. He wanted to say no, wanted to lift her into his arms and tell her she was perfect, that she was still his little girl who used to follow him through the orchards carrying a basket twice her size. But he didn't. He only sighed, reached out and smoothed her hair. "Your mama means well." Sarah nodded, though she didn't understand. From downstairs came the clink of china and another burst of laughter. Margaret's laughter, brittle, practiced, hollow. Thomas stood. "You mind her now?" he said softly, and left the room. He never saw her reach for the biscuit hidden beneath her pillow, or how she broke it in half before eating. Downstairs, Margaret's voice floated through the hall again. "A lady must learn to master herself before she expects the world to respect her." Thomas poured himself a drink and said nothing. He'd learned long ago that his silence was easier for everyone. But that night, lying beside his wife in their immaculate bed, he heard a faint sound through the walls. A child chewing softly in the dark, and then trying not to cry. The Whitlock house slept lightly, like something afraid of its own dreams. Floorboards creaked even when no one walked them, and the walls seemed to hold their breath between the ticking of the clock and the moaning of the wind outside. Sarah had learned how to move through that silence without waking it. She slipped from her bed barefoot, her nightdress brushing the floor, a candle trembling in her small hand with every step. She followed the familiar scent that had comforted her for as long as she could remember. Warm bread, bacon grease, something sweet and smoky that always seemed to linger even after the fires died down. The kitchen was her favorite room in the house. Not because she was hungry, though she was, but because it was the only place that ever felt alive. Tonight the fire burned low but steady. A pot simmered quietly, and the air carried the soft, sleepy hum of something human. That's when she saw the girl. Smaller than she'd expected, maybe her age, maybe a little younger. Barefoot too, her feet dusted with ash, her hair tied up in a faded red cloth. She stood on a stool, stirring the pot with both hands, humming under her breath. When she noticed Sarah she froze, the wooden spoon clattering against the pot. "I ain't mean to wake nobody," the girl whispered, her voice small but steady. Sarah shook her head. "You didn't." They looked at each other for a long moment. Two children from different worlds, standing in the same pool of firelight. "What's your name?" Sarah asked finally. "Hetty." The name suited her. Soft and simple, like something whispered to a child before sleep. Sarah pointed at the pot. "What's that?" "Stew. For the field hands come morning." Sarah's stomach growled before she could stop it, and her cheeks flushed. Hetty glanced at her, then toward the door, then back again, before reaching for a small tin bowl. She filled it halfway and held it out. "You can have a little," she said quietly. "Ain't nobody going to miss it." Sarah hesitated, then took it. The stew was warm and thick and tasted like kindness. She ate slowly, afraid it might vanish if she hurried. Hetty smiled faintly. "You always come down here at night?" Sarah nodded. "Mama don't like when I eat after supper." "Why not?" "She says it makes me ugly." The words came out soft, as if she wasn't sure they should be spoken aloud. Hetty's brow furrowed. "Ain't nothing ugly about being hungry." Sarah blinked as though hearing that for the first time. A creak sounded from the hallway. Footsteps, faint but real. Hetty snatched the bowl and dumped the rest of the stew into the ashes. Both girls held their breath as the steps passed, then faded. When it was safe again, Hetty whispered, "You best go before somebody sees." Sarah nodded and turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she looked back and gave a small, trembling smile that looked almost like hope. In that kitchen, lit by the dying fire, Hetty smiled back. Over the following nights, Sarah returned again and again, always barefoot, always quiet, always drawn by the faint hum of Hetty's song. It became their secret hour, the one stretch of the day when neither of them was watched or measured. Hetty would wait by the hearth, pretending to scrub pots long after May and the others had gone to bed. When she heard the stairs creak, she'd smile to herself and whisper, "You come on, Miss Sarah." The kitchen would glow in the soft amber of dying coals, and Sarah would sit on a stool beside the table, feet swinging, candle in hand, while Hetty ladled out a little stew, a saved biscuit, or sometimes just a spoonful of molasses. They ate together in silence, their chewing mixing with the low crackle of the fire. For the first time in her life, Sarah didn't feel wrong. She didn't have to hide her hunger or her laughter. Hetty never told her to stop, and she never looked at her the way grown-ups did, with disgust or pity or shame. "You ever get in trouble for this?" Sarah asked one night. Hetty shrugged. "Ain't the worst thing I done." "You don't have to," Sarah said softly. "Mama says I shouldn't eat much, that it's better for me." Hetty wiped her hands on her apron. "Your mama ever go hungry?" Sarah thought for a moment, frowning. "I don't think so." "Then she don't know what better means," Hetty said simply. Sarah giggled, then covered her mouth. It was the first real laugh Hetty had ever heard from her. Outside, frogs sang in the river grass, and the air hung thick with magnolia and smoke. In that small, forgotten room, the two girls carved out something no one could quite name. Not friendship, exactly, but a shared loneliness that fed on itself. May sometimes caught sight of them when she came to stoke the fire before dawn. She'd stand quietly at the door, watching the two girls hunched over their bowls, heads nearly touching. Her heart ached, but she said nothing. There were some kindnesses the world simply had no room for. One night, Hetty passed Sarah a small tin cup of sweet milk, whispering, "You drink it slow now." Sarah took a sip and sighed, eyes closing. "This tastes like happy." Hetty grinned. "It's just milk." "No," Sarah said dreamily. "It's more than that." The hall clock struck midnight, and both girls froze. "You better go," Hetty said quickly. "If Mistress finds you." Sarah nodded and slipped away, her candle flickering in the dark. When she reached her room, she hid the cup beneath her pillow, as if keeping some piece of that hour close to her. Downstairs, Hetty washed the dishes in silence, smiling faintly. For the first time since arriving at Rosefield, she didn't feel invisible. But in the room above, Sarah's mother was still awake, and she had heard the faint creak of the stairs. Morning light slanted through the parlor like a blade. Margaret Whitlock moved through it slowly, a porcelain cup trembling faintly in her hand. She wasn't tired. She never allowed herself to be tired, but she was unsettled. The house had whispered again the night before. Footsteps, faint ones, too light to be a servant, too late to be her husband. She set the cup down and noticed it, the faintest dusting of crumbs on the carpet near the stairs, a single greasy fingerprint on the polished banister. Her jaw tightened. By the time she reached Sarah Ann's room, her calm had hardened into something colder. She knocked once, then entered without waiting for an answer. Sarah sat up quickly, clutching her pillow, her cheeks flushed, curls tangled from sleep. "Good morning, Mama." Margaret's eyes swept the room, the folded nightdress at the foot of the bed, the candle stub on the table, the faint smell of smoke and sugar that had no business being upstairs. She lifted the pillow and found it. A small tin cup, its bottom streaked with milk. She held it up, her expression unreadable. "Where did you get this?" Sarah's lips parted, but no sound came out. "Well," Margaret pressed. "Speak up, child." I was thirsty," Sarah stammered. "I went to the kitchen." Margaret said nothing for a long moment. Then she smiled, slow and thin. "At night?" Sarah nodded weakly. Her mother set the cup down on the vanity and straightened her posture. "You're a young lady, not an animal wandering the house for scraps. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Then you'll eat what I give you when I give it. Nothing more." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice until it sounded almost kind. "Do you know why I'm hard on you, Sarah Ann?" The girl shook her head. "Because I love you," she said. "Because I want the world to look at you and see something worth admiring, not something to pity." Sarah blinked through her tears, unsure whether she was being comforted or condemned. From the doorway, Hetty watched silently, a stack of folded linens in her arms. Margaret turned to her sharply. "You," she said, "did you know about this?" Hetty froze. "No, ma'am." Margaret studied her face, that careful stillness only the enslaved learn to wear. "See that it doesn't happen again." "Yes, ma'am." As Margaret swept from the room, her skirts whispering across the floor. The air seemed to collapse behind her. Hetty set the linens down and moved to Sarah's bedside. "You all right, Miss Sarah?" Sarah nodded, though her throat felt tight. "She ain't mad," she whispered. "She's just fixing me." Hetty frowned. "You ain't broke." Sarah looked down at her hands, pale and trembling.
Mama zaisiam.
Outside, magnolia petals drifted past the window, soft and white, falling slow, like snow that refused to melt. By the end of that week, the kitchen no longer smelled of comfort. It smelled of control, starch, soap, and silence. Margaret had taken the keys from May, declaring she would restore order. Now every loaf, every jar, every sack of flour was counted, measured, and locked away. At breakfast, she brought with her a small leather-bound notebook and a silver pen. She called it her house ledger, but everyone in the house knew it was really Sarah Ann's. The first morning she used it, she sat across from her daughter with a calm that felt like cruelty wrapped in silk. "From now on," she said, "we'll be keeping records of what goes into that little mouth of yours. For your own good." She wrote neatly on the first page. Breakfast, 1 egg, half biscuit, 1 slice bacon, milk, half cup. Behavior, satisfactory. Then she glanced up and smiled. "You see? Nothing to fear. A lady must be accountable for what she consumes." Hetty stood against the wall, eyes on the floor, a folded napkin in her hands. She could feel the child's shame filling the room like heat. Sarah ate slowly, each bite heavier than the last. When she finished, her mother closed the ledger, smoothing a hand over the cover like a promise. "Good," Margaret said softly. "We'll do this again at midday." By noon, the ritual had become something else entirely. Not a record, but a performance. Margaret dictated each meal like a prayer. 2 bites of ham, 1 biscuit.
No butter.
Every mouthful Sarah took, her mother marked down. Every glance toward the kitchen door, every hesitation, became a note in the margin. Thomas watched once, then left the table before the meal was finished. He couldn't bear it, though he'd never say so aloud. "Discipline builds character," he muttered on his way out, half to his wife, half to himself. After dinner, Hetty carried the plates away and found Sarah alone in the hallway, her head pressed against the wall. "You don't got to cry," Hetty whispered. Sarah sniffled. "Mama says I do it to myself, that I make her ashamed." She turned her tear-streaked face toward Hetty. "She's wrong. Then why do I feel like she's right?" The question hung between them, heavier than hunger. That night, Margaret added 1 more line to the ledger. Evening, refused dessert. Praiseworthy restraint. Then, almost as an afterthought, she dipped her pen again and wrote. Note: Hetty to remain with her during meals for supervision. She closed the book and blew out the candle. Outside, the moon hung white and swollen over Rosefield, watching the house with the same quiet pity as the magnolias. Inside, Sarah lay awake in the dark, her stomach growling, her hands folded as though praying for something she couldn't quite name. Not food, not forgiveness, but maybe for her mother to stop loving her in this particular way. The days that followed stretched long and heavy, like the air before a storm. Meals became ceremonies, and Margaret their presiding priestess. She kept her ledger tucked beneath her arm the way some women carried their Bibles. She called it a record of progress. Everyone else called it the Book of Hunger. Thomas noticed the changes but said little. He spent longer hours outside, walking the fields, inspecting fences that didn't need mending. He told himself the quiet of the land steadied him, but really, he just couldn't stand the silence of the house anymore. That cold, delicate quiet that made him feel like a guest in his own home. At night, he'd pause by Sarah's door, sometimes hearing her whisper to someone. Once he thought she was praying, but leaning closer, he heard another voice, softer and lower, like a lullaby. It was Hetty. Inside the small room, the 2 girls sat cross-legged on the floor with a candle between them. Sarah wore her nightdress, Hetty still had her apron on. The air smelled faintly of soap and lamp oil. "Tell me again," Sarah said softly. "About the river." Hetty smiled. "Mama used to say the river don't run out. Said it just goes on, even when you can't see it no more. She said that's how love works, too." Sarah frowned. "My mama says love hurts." Hetty shook her head. "Love ain't supposed to hurt. It's supposed to feed you." Sarah looked down at her thin wrists folded in her lap. "Then why does it make me feel empty?" Hetty didn't answer right away. She simply reached across the small space and took Sarah's hand. "You ain't empty," she whispered. "You just ain't been fed right." The candle flame wavered, throwing their shadows against the wall. Two small figures holding hands, their faces mirrored in the flicker. Down the hall, May watched them through the crack of the door, her heart aching, though she didn't interrupt. She knew some things in that house only survived because they stayed secret. The next morning, Thomas found Margaret in the parlor, writing again in her ledger. "You think you're helping her," he said quietly. "But she's fading, Maggie. Look at her." Margaret didn't look up. "You wouldn't understand. You've never been a mother." Thomas's jaw tightened.
No.
"But I had one, and she never made me feel like a burden." Margaret's pen froze mid-word. For the first time in a long while, her expression cracked. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that smooth, unshakable calm. "If you won't support me," she said evenly, "then stay out of my way." He did. That night, Sarah whispered to Hetty that she dreamed of the river, wide and endless, carrying her away from the house and its rules and ledgers. When she woke, she swore she could still hear the water, faint and far off, as if it were calling her name. By the end of that summer, Sarah had mastered the art of secrecy. She didn't call it rebellion. She was too young to know the word, but her body understood it anyway. It knew how to move softly, how to hide, how to steal just enough to keep the world from swallowing her whole. At breakfast, she took her measured bites and kept her face blank. But when Margaret turned her head to pour coffee or glance toward the window, Sarah slipped a crust of biscuit into her pocket. At supper, a spoonful of rice, a scrap of ham. She hid them in the folds of her dress, pressing her hand over them like she was guarding treasure. In her room, once the candles burned low and the house went quiet, she'd pull the food from her pockets, crumbs warm and soft from her own body, and eat them slowly in the dark. Each bite was small and deliberate, a prayer she didn't have to speak aloud. Sometimes she'd hear her mother's footsteps in the hallway and freeze. The floorboards outside her door would creak, pause, then fade. When the silence returned, she'd chew again, tears mixing with the salt of the food. Hetty found out one evening when she came to bring linens and saw Sarah brushing crumbs from her lap. "You'll make yourself sick," she whispered. Sarah shook her head. "It's better when I eat quiet." Hetty frowned. "You shouldn't have to hide for something everybody else gets to do." Sarah's eyes went wide, almost pleading. "Don't tell." Hetty didn't. She simply nodded and helped brush the crumbs away. From that night on, she began slipping Sarah little things whenever she could. A slice of apple, a heel of cornbread, a spoonful of jam folded into a napkin, leaving them tucked behind the sewing basket or the curtain. It became their language. Hetty never spoke of it, and Sarah never thanked her. Not out of rudeness, but reverence. Gratitude made it real, and real things could be taken away. Meanwhile, Margaret grew ever more obsessed with control. She began weighing Sarah's dresses, convinced she could see the change in every seam, and added new columns to her ledger. Behavior after meals, demeanor during prayer. Each day her voice sharpened, like a knife honed on routine. "You will not undo my work," she'd whisper whenever Sarah turned away. "You will not shame me again." But sometimes, when Margaret looked into her daughter's face, she caught a flash of something she couldn't name. Not defiance, exactly, but a kind of quiet endurance that frightened her. Because despite all her efforts, Sarah wasn't fading. She was surviving. Late one night, Hetty brought a biscuit wrapped in cloth and set it on the dresser. Sarah looked at her and smiled, the kind of smile that carried both apology and gratitude. Neither said it aloud, but they both knew. In that house, every crumb was an act of rebellion. Margaret Whitlock believed that shame, displayed properly, could be made to look like virtue. So when she received Mrs. Clara Beaumont's letter about the upcoming ladies' supper, she decided it was time to remind everyone in Jefferson County that discipline still lived at Rosefield Plantation. The house was scrubbed until the floors shone like glass. Silver was polished, curtains pressed, candles trimmed. Margaret planned every detail herself, down to the arrangement of flowers, white, perfect magnolias from the garden, standing in a tall glass vase at the center of the table. Thomas asked gently, "Do we need to have guests this week? The child's been—" "She will attend," Margaret interrupted, her tone smooth as the tablecloth. "A Whitlock doesn't hide from the world. She learns from it." That evening, Sarah was dressed in a pale yellow gown that pinched at the waist. Hetty fastened the buttons, careful not to meet her eyes. The fabric was stiff, the kind that refused to bend when you breathed. "It's pretty," Hetty whispered, trying to offer something kind. "It hurts," Sarah murmured. "I know." Downstairs, the dining room flickered with candlelight, the air rich with roast, sugared peaches, and something sharper beneath it, the perfume of polished things hiding decay. The guests arrived in a flutter of fans and laughter. Mrs. Beaumont led the conversation, her voice lilting and false, while her daughter Elise trailed behind her, dainty and ribboned, the kind of child whose very presence made Margaret's jaw tighten. "Sarah and," Margaret called sweetly, "come say good evening." The room fell quiet as Sarah stepped into the doorway, candlelight warming her cheeks pink. She curtsied, wobbling a little. Mrs. Beaumont smiled too widely. "My, how she's grown." She hesitated. "Healthy." Margaret's hand stiffened around her glass. "Yes," she said, smiling back. "We're working on that." Laughter fluttered weakly around the table, the polite kind that sounds like pity. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. As they sat for supper, Margaret made a show of serving Sarah's plate herself. "Portioning," she explained to her guests. "It teaches restraint." Each bite Sarah took felt like a performance. Knife and fork balanced just so, napkin folded on her lap, and she could feel every eye on her. Her mother's ledger wasn't on the table, but its presence hung over the room all the same. When Sarah hesitated over a peach slice, Margaret leaned closer. "Don't you want to show everyone how much better you've become?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Then finish." The room went still as Sarah obeyed, swallowing the sweetness that suddenly tasted like salt. Mrs. Beaumont's fan fluttered faster. Elise looked down at her plate, pretending not to see. When the last course was cleared, Margaret smiled like a woman who had just won a silent war. "See?" she said softly to Clara. "Every lady can be trained, if she's loved enough." And across the table, Sarah sat motionless, hands folded neatly in her lap, the perfect picture of a child who'd learned to starve with grace. The house fell quiet again after the guests left, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that holds its breath before something cruel happens. Margaret moved through the dining room alone, her heels soft against the rug, her fingers brushing the linen tablecloth as if searching for imperfection. She stopped when she found it. A crumb, no bigger than a fingernail, resting near the edge of Sarah's plate. Her expression didn't change, but the air in the room shifted. From the hallway came Hetty, carrying a tray of teacups back to the kitchen. "You were serving tonight, weren't you?" Margaret asked, her voice calm, almost kind. "Yes, ma'am." "Then perhaps you can explain to me why my daughter's plate isn't spotless." Hetty froze, eyes darting to the crumb. Maybe I missed it, ma'am." Margaret stepped closer, her perfume heavy and sweet. "You missed it." "Yes, ma'am." The smile she gave was gentle and terrifying. "Go wait by the back steps." Hetty hesitated a beat too long, and Margaret's smile faded. "Now." May found her outside in the dark kitchen yard, trembling. "What you done, child?" "Nothing," Hetty whispered. Just forgot a crumb. May closed her eyes. You stay quiet. Don't give her reason to make it worse. But Margaret didn't need a reason. She came out moments later holding the thin switch she kept by the door for discipline. Her tone soft, her movements measured. She never believed in noise or mess. You'll remember next time, she said simply, and struck Hetty's hands, once, twice again. The girl didn't cry. She bit her lip so hard it bled. Inside the house, Sarah stood in the hallway, her back pressed to the wall, listening. Each sound, the swish of the switch, the dull breath that followed, carved itself into her chest. When it was over, she crept downstairs. The door to the yard still hung open. She found Hetty sitting on the steps, shoulders shaking silently, her hands red and trembling. Sarah knelt beside her, eyes wide.
I'm sorry.
It's my fault. Hetty shook her head. No, ma'am, it ain't. Sarah hesitated, then pulled a handkerchief from her sleeve and wrapped it around Hetty's hands. Small, white, embroidered with her own initials. One of the few things that belonged only to her. You keep it, she said. Hetty didn't argue. She only nodded, tears streaking her soot-stained face. From the doorway, May watched, the mistress's daughter and the servant's child, bound by the same quiet pain. Later, when Sarah climbed into bed, she pressed her face into the pillow and whispered to herself, over and over, Mama loves me. Mama loves me. But the words no longer sounded like comfort. They sounded like something breaking. And in the yard below, Hetty sat beneath the magnolia tree, staring up at the house, whispering to the wind, Don't let her take that child's heart. The mirrors at Rosefield had always been part of the house. Tall, ornate, gilded in gold leaf that caught the light like trapped fire. But after that night, Sarah began to see them differently, starting with the one in the upstairs hallway. Each morning, when Margaret brushed past her on the way to breakfast, she'd stop, turn Sarah toward the glass, and smooth the child's hair with cool, deliberate hands. Look, she'd say softly. That's what everyone sees when they look at you. Do you like it? Sarah never knew how to answer. The mirror showed her a round face, pale cheeks, soft arms. The same girl she had always been. But her mother's silence afterward made it feel as though something were wrong with the reflection. Margaret would sigh, her tone polite and distant. It's all right. You'll learn to change what can be changed. Sarah didn't know what that meant, but she began trying anyway. When no one was watching, she'd stand before the mirror and pull her nightdress tight against her stomach, sucking in until she couldn't breathe, then release it in a shudder. The glass would fog faintly from her exhale, as if even it didn't want to look at her. Some nights she'd whisper to her own reflection, I'm sorry. I'll be better tomorrow. Hetty found her like that once, standing in the moonlight, staring at her own face as if waiting for it to apologize back. Miss Sarah, Hetty whispered, stepping inside. You'll catch a chill. Sarah didn't move. Hetty, if I were pretty, Mama would stop being sad. The words came out small, half-broken. Hetty stepped closer. Ain't nothing wrong with your face. You just got more of it than some. Sarah blinked, confused, then laughed. Just a little, a soft sound that almost hurt coming out. But once Hetty left, the laughter faded, and the mirror waited. That same night, Margaret wrote another entry in her ledger. Child shows improvement in restraint, but lacks awareness of presentation. Must emphasize dignity and self-possession. Then, beneath it, begin morning reflection exercises to instill accountability. The next day, she made Sarah stand before the parlor mirror after each meal. You see, she'd murmur, you eat too much. It shows here first, her fingers brushing the girl's cheek. And here, Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. After a week, she no longer needed her mother's reminders. She went to the mirror on her own, pressing her small hands against the glass until her breath fogged it and her reflection blurred and vanished. Sometimes she thought she saw another version of herself looking back. Smaller, thinner, prettier, the kind her mother might love. On those nights, when the house was still and even the magnolias outside seemed to sleep, Sarah would whisper to the darkened glass, "Tomorrow, I'll be her. I promise." The preacher came on a Sunday afternoon, his carriage rolling up the dirt drive like a shadow that didn't belong to the light. Reverend Elijah Grafton had been visiting Rosefield since before Sarah was born, a thin man with a silver cross that hung too heavy for his narrow chest. He spoke softly, but every word sounded like a warning. Margaret met him at the door herself, dressed in pale lavender, her hair pinned neatly. "Reverend," she said sweetly, "thank you for coming. The Lord's been testing our household lately." He smiled the way pious men do, pity disguised as approval. "He tests those he loves, Mistress Whitlock." Inside, the house felt too clean, the smell of lemon polish and candle smoke pressing close. Sarah stood by the parlor wall, small and silent, her hands folded like a penitent. Hetty stood a few steps behind, carrying a tray of tea she wasn't permitted to drink. Margaret gestured to her daughter. "She's been struggling with temptation," she said softly, as though describing a fever. "I've tried disciplined prayer, but—" The preacher's eyes settled on Sarah. "Temptation comes in many forms," he said, "and the devil hides himself best in the small indulgences." Sarah's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure if he was speaking about her, or to her. Margaret nodded solemnly. "Exactly. I fear her appetite has become a reflection of weakness." Reverend Grafton laid a hand on his Bible. "Then she must learn restraint, not for vanity's sake, but for her soul. The flesh is the door through which sin enters." His gaze lingered on the child, not cruel, but heavy, like judgment wrapped in scripture. "You wish to be good, don't you, Sarah Ann?" "Yes, sir." "Then you must master your desires. Hunger, gluttony, pride, they're all the same serpent wearing different faces. The body must be ruled by the spirit." Margaret's eyes glowed with vindication. "You see, Sarah? The Reverend agrees. We'll begin a fast tomorrow for cleansing." Sarah's throat tightened. "How long, Mama?" "Until the Lord tells us you're pure again," Margaret said gently. When the Reverend left, the house felt smaller, as though his words had taken up space no one could reclaim. That night, Hetty slipped into Sarah's room and found her sitting at the window, staring into the dark. "You don't got to listen to him," Hetty whispered. "He don't know what you've been through." Sarah didn't turn around. "He's God's man. If he says I'm full of sin, then I must be." Hetty wanted to argue, but she saw the way Sarah's fingers dug into her own arms, the way her small shoulders shook without sound. So she simply stood beside her until the candle burned low. Outside, the magnolias swayed in the night breeze, shedding their white petals one by one. And inside, the fasting began, not as punishment but as prayer. The fast began on a Monday, the same quiet way most punishments began at Rosefield, as though it were simply part of the natural order. Margaret announced it at breakfast. "There will be no bread on the table this week," she said evenly.
No butter, no sweets.
"The Lord calls us to cleanse, and we will answer." Thomas looked up from his newspaper. "Maggie," she didn't let him finish, "if we cannot discipline the body, we do not deserve grace." Sarah sat very still, her small hands folded in her lap. Across the room, Hetty carried a pitcher of water, pretending not to listen, though her stomach tightened with dread. She already knew what cleansing meant in that house. It never stopped with the mistress. When the meal ended, Margaret turned to her. "You'll stay by her side, Hetty, every moment. You'll fast together. She'll learn obedience from your example." Hetty blinked. "Yes, ma'am." That night, the kitchen went dark early. May, who had lived through enough seasons of cruelty to know better, said nothing. She simply slipped a piece of bread into her apron pocket, praying neither child would need it. By the second day, Sarah's head ached. She tried to pray, but her thoughts kept circling back to the smell of cornbread drifting faintly from the servants' quarters. Hetty stayed close, steadying her when she swayed, lowering her eyes and murmuring scripture whenever Margaret entered the room. Words that sounded holy but meant nothing to her. "You're learning restraint," Margaret said approvingly on the third day. "Your body will thank you for this." Sarah nodded faintly, too weak to argue. That night, once the mistress had finally gone to bed, Hetty crept into the kitchen and knelt by the stove. She pulled out the bread May had hidden, tore it in half and carried it upstairs. Sarah was awake, her eyes hollow, her lips pale. When she saw the bread, she shook her head. "Mama will know." "Then we don't tell her," Hetty whispered. Sarah hesitated, then took a small bite. The bread crumbled on her tongue like salvation, and tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Hetty watched her chew, her own throat tight. "It's just food," she said softly. "Ain't no sin in wanting to live." But in Rosefield, even life had to be justified. The next morning, Margaret stood at the parlor window, watching the two girls walk slowly across the yard toward church, their steps small and unsteady, hands clasped like two pilgrims bound for repentance. Thomas watched too, his jaw working, though no words came out. He wanted to tell his wife this was madness, that faith didn't have to look like suffering, but he said nothing. As the girls disappeared down the path, magnolia petals swirled in the wind, pale and weightless, falling gently to the ground, as if the world itself were fasting alongside them. By the fourth day, the house had gone eerily still. Even the servants moved more quietly, their steps softened, their words whispered, as though the very walls of Rosefield were holding their breath. Sarah could no longer stand through prayers without leaning against the pew. Her skin had turned the color of milk left too long in the sun. Pale, thin, lifeless. When she tried to speak, her voice cracked like paper. Margaret called it progress. "She's learning control," she told Thomas over supper, though he had no appetite for his own plate. "By mastering her hunger, she'll master her nature." Thomas said nothing. He kept his eyes on his food but didn't eat. Every word from his wife sounded rehearsed, like a sermon she'd written for herself and refused to stop preaching. May couldn't bear it any longer. That night, while Margaret worked over her ledger in the parlor, May slipped into the kitchen, heart hammering, and tore a piece of cornbread from the cooling rack, wrapping it in a clean rag. When she reached Sarah's room, Hetty was already sitting beside the bed, wiping the girl's forehead with a damp cloth. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. "Miss May, is it Sunday already?" May forced a smile. "Not yet, baby. But I brought you something." She handed Hetty the bundle. The smell of bread filled the room, warm, sweet, alive. Sarah reached out weakly, but Hetty shook her head. "You need it more," she said, pressing it back into the older woman's hands. May's throat tightened. "You hush. Both of y'all need it." Sarah took a small, trembling bite. Hetty tore off a piece for herself. The three of them sat together in silence, their faces lit by the faint flicker of the lamp. For a few minutes it felt almost safe, but the walls of Rosefield had ears. Margaret opened the door without knocking. The lamp flame wavered, then steadied on her pale face. Her eyes went first to Sarah's hands, then to the crumbs on the floor. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting. May rose slowly, hiding her shaking hands in her apron. "Mistress." Margaret didn't look at her. "Get out." "Ma'am, please, get out." May left, her steps heavy, tears already spilling before she reached the hallway. Margaret turned to Hetty. "You'll stay with her," she said coldly. "From now on, you don't leave her side. If she eats, you'll answer for it. If she disobeys, you'll both learn discipline together." She locked the door behind her. For a long time, neither girl spoke. Sarah stared at the doorknob, her small hands trembling. "She thinks I can't stop," she whispered. "She thinks I'll always want more." Hetty sat down beside her on the floor, their shoulders touching. "Then we stop together," she said softly. "Only till she forgets." But Margaret Whitlock never forgot anything. From that night on, the two girls ate only what she allowed, her silence, her scripture, and her shame. The days blurred together after that, hunger and silence stitched so tightly they became the same thing. The door to Sarah's room stayed locked, the key hanging from Margaret's belt. She brought the meals herself now, carrying the tray like a ritual offering. Sometimes a single biscuit, sometimes nothing at all. "This is what strength feels like," she'd say, setting it on the dresser. "You'll thank me one day." Sarah would nod, too afraid to meet her eyes. When the door closed behind her mother, she'd wait until the footsteps faded, then whisper to Hetty, "I can still hear her." "Who?"
Mama.
"She talks even when she's gone." At first, Hetty thought Sarah was joking, another childish game to survive the boredom. But soon the voice came even when Sarah was asleep. She'd wake in the middle of the night, eyes wide, whispering answers to questions only she could hear. "Stop eating so fast," she'd mumble, half dreaming. "Sit up straight. Don't make me look at you." Hetty would shake her gently. "Ain't nobody here, Miss Sarah." But Sarah would only stare at the mirror across the room, her voice trembling. "She's always here." One morning, Margaret unlocked the door and found Sarah sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring into the glass. "What are you doing?" "Waiting for you," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, too calm. Margaret's smile faltered. "You'll wash and come down. We're having company this evening." Sarah didn't move. "You already said that yesterday." "You're confused, darling."
No, Mama.
Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the mirror. "You keep saying the same things every day, even when you're not here." For a moment, something flickered across Margaret's face. Not guilt, not pity, but fear. Then it vanished. She reached for her daughter's hand. "You're tired. That's all." Sarah pulled away. "I'm what you made." The words struck harder than any slap. Margaret stepped back, the color draining from her cheeks. That night, Sarah refused to eat. The tray stayed untouched on the floor. When Margaret came to check, she found both girls asleep beside each other, Hetty's arm around Sarah's shoulders, their breaths shallow and synchronized. She stood there a long time, candle in hand, the flame flickering like a pulse. Something buried deep inside her trembled, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she blew out the candle and left them in the dark. In the stillness, Sarah stirred. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, then whispered the words that had begun to haunt the halls of Rosefield. "She's in my head, Hetty, even when I'm quiet." And somewhere in the dark, Hetty whispered back, her voice breaking, "I know." By midsummer, the air inside Rosefield had grown thick and heavy, as though the house itself were breathing shallowly. The walls seemed to listen now, every whisper, every footstep, every thought hanging suspended in the humid silence. Sarah spent most of her time at the window. The magnolia tree outside had begun to shed its last blossoms, leaving behind green pods that cracked open in the heat. She watched them fall one by one, like tiny hearts too heavy to hold on. Hetty sat on the floor beside her, sewing a torn hem. "You don't got to keep looking out there," she said softly. "Ain't nothing but fields." Sarah didn't turn her head. "It's something else when you walk far enough." Hetty paused. "Far enough." "The river." Sarah's voice was quiet but certain. "I can hear it sometimes at night. It sounds like it's calling." Hetty's fingers stilled on the fabric. "Ain't nothing down there but water and snakes." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then maybe it'll take me somewhere snakes can't go." Hetty didn't answer. She only kept sewing, her needle trembling in her fingers. That evening, Margaret visited again. Her visits had grown more frequent lately, as though she could feel something slipping beyond her reach. She brought the tray, the same measured portion, the same brittle smile. "You look pale, my darling," she said. "You're wasting what I've given you." Sarah didn't reply. Margaret set the tray down harder than she meant to. "You think I enjoy this? You think I like watching you suffer? I'm trying to save you." The child's gaze lifted, calm and hollow. "From what?" Margaret blinked. "From yourself." "You mean from you?" Sarah said quietly. The words hung in the air, small and soft, but sharp as glass. For a moment Margaret's face changed. She wasn't the mistress of Rosefield anymore, just a woman standing before something she'd broken and couldn't fix. Then the mask returned. "You'll eat now," she said coldly, "and you'll pray for forgiveness before bed." When she left, the lock clicked again, that sound of finality both girls had come to dread. Sarah turned to Hetty. "She says she's saving me." Hetty looked up from her sewing. "You don't need saving." Sarah's voice wavered. "Then why do I feel like I'm disappearing?" The window stood open a crack, and the faint rush of the distant river drifted in with the night air. "'Cause she want you to," Hetty whispered. "She think if you small enough, quiet enough, she can keep you forever." Sarah rested her chin on her knees. "Then maybe the river will take what's left." Hetty dropped her needle and grabbed her hand. "Don't say that, Miss Sarah. You hear me? Don't you ever say that." Sarah nodded, though her eyes never left the window. Outside, lightning flickered over the distant trees, and for the first time in weeks, thunder rolled low, trembling, as though the earth itself were warning the house that something was about to break. The storm arrived that night. Not a summer drizzle, but a wild, heaving rage that clawed at the windows and shook the shutters loose. Lightning split the sky again and again, bathing the magnolia tree in flashes of white fire. The whole house seemed to groan beneath the weight of it. Sarah sat awake on her bed, hands pressed to her ears, every crack of thunder feeling as though it came from inside her own chest. Hetty crouched at the window, trying to latch it against the wind, rain already slicking her arms. "You scared?" Hetty asked, her voice nearly drowned by the noise. Sarah shook her head, though her eyes were wide and glassy.
No.
"It's just loud. Storm will pass," Hetty said. "They always do. But this one didn't sound like it wanted to pass. It sounded like it wanted in." Downstairs, Margaret Whitlock moved through the parlor like a ghost, her candle wavering, throwing her shadow long and trembling against the walls. She'd been reading her ledger when the first thunder struck, but now her hand shook too badly to write. Every page felt like proof of something she'd failed to control. She set the book down and whispered to herself, "She'll ruin everything if I let her," unsure whether she meant Sarah or herself. When she climbed the stairs, the candlelight danced wildly, painting the hallway in gold and black. She stopped at her daughter's door, listening. A muffled voice. Two of them. The door was locked, but she had the key. Inside, the girls huddled together on the floor, the lamp blown out, rain leaking through the window seam. Hetty had her arm around Sarah, whispering something too soft to catch. When the door burst open, both jumped. "What are you doing?" Margaret demanded, her hair loose now, her face pale and wet with candle sweat. "You're supposed to be in bed." Sarah looked up, her voice trembling. "It's just the storm, Mama. We were scared." "Don't you lie to me," Margaret hissed. "You've been defying me in my own house. You think I don't see it." Hetty stood quickly, placing herself between them. "She ain't done nothing, ma'am. She's just tired." Margaret's hand shot out, grabbing Hetty's wrist. "You will not speak for her." The girl winced but didn't pull away. "Then let her speak for herself." For a heartbeat, the only sound was rain slamming against the windows. Margaret's hand trembled. Then she let go. "You want to save her, do you?" she whispered. "Then keep her pure. Don't feed her. Don't comfort her. Let the Lord do his work." She turned to leave, but the wind caught the candle flame. It jumped, caught the edge of the curtain. A spark, a hiss, a bloom of orange.
Mom.
Hetty shouted. "The fire!" Margaret spun, horror flashing across her face as the flame climbed the fabric. She lunged forward, but the wind fed it faster. The whole drape caught, light spilling across the room like dawn made of smoke. Sarah screamed, the sound breaking through everything at once. The thunder, the rain, the silence. And in that moment, everything Margaret had built, Her order, her rules, her perfect reflection, began to burn. The fire spread as though it had only been waiting for permission. In seconds, the curtain was gone. Flame licking up the wallpaper, racing along the wooden molding, the room turning from gold to orange to terror. Smoke rolled across the ceiling like a storm within the storm. Hetty pulled Sarah toward the door. "Come on." But Margaret blocked the way, her face lit by the fire's reflection, eyes wide with something between madness and awe. "You can't run from me," she cried. "You'll only destroy yourself." The air cracked as the roof groaned overhead. Hetty coughed, dragging Sarah behind her. "Move, ma'am." Margaret didn't. Her gaze locked on her daughter. Trembling, soot-streaked, eyes reflecting the firelight like mirrors. "You look just like her," she whispered. Sarah froze. "Like who?" "My mother," Margaret said faintly, stepping closer. "She said the same things to me about being small, being proper, being loved. I thought I could do better." Her voice broke into a laugh that didn't sound human. "But you're just like me." Hetty stepped in front of Sarah again. "We ain't got time for this," she shouted, grabbing the iron bed frame and swinging it against the burning curtain rod. Sparks burst across the room, ash falling like snow. Margaret turned toward her, voice sharp. "You're not taking her from me." Hetty stared back, her voice shaking. "Ain't nobody taking her. You already did." For a moment, the two of them, mistress and servant, mother and protector, stood facing each other through a haze of smoke. Then a beam cracked overhead and came crashing down. Hetty lunged, shoving Sarah toward the door just as it fell. The noise was deafening, the heat unbearable. The three of them were separated, Margaret on one side, the girls on the other, a wall of flame now standing between them. "Sarah!" Margaret screamed. "Come back! I can fix this." Sarah's eyes streamed with tears, her small hand clutching Hetty's. "Mama!" Hetty coughed, pulling her away. "You can't fix fire, baby. You run." The hallway filled with smoke. Every breath burned. The air shimmered with heat, the walls cracking as though the house itself were breaking apart. They stumbled down the stairs, each step creaking, glowing embers falling around them like angry stars. Behind them, Margaret's voice echoed faintly, a hoarse whisper lost in the chaos. "You'll thank me when you're clean." The parlor doors burst open as they reached the bottom. The storm outside roared louder now, rain and fire meeting in violent harmony. Hetty threw open the front door, and the sudden rush of cold air slammed into them like mercy. "Run, Miss Sarah." The child turned once, just once, and saw her mother at the top of the stairs, framed in orange light, her face strangely calm, as if she'd finally accepted something. Then the ceiling gave way. The sound was enormous. Wood, glass, thunder, and memory collapsing all at once. Hetty pulled Sarah out into the rain, the fire's glow chasing them across the yard. The magnolia tree burned behind them, its blossoms falling like ghosts. They didn't stop running until they reached the river. The rain came down hard by the time they reached the water, thick sheets that blurred the world into gray and gold. The river itself was swollen, dark, and wild, thunder rolling across it like something alive. Hetty fell to her knees at the bank, coughing hard, her lungs full of smoke. She could still taste the fire, that bitter, metallic flavor of everything ending. Sarah stood beside her, trembling from cold and fear, her nightdress clinging to her small frame. Behind them, Rosefield burned, the orange light glowing through the trees, a false sunrise over the ruin of everything they'd known. The magnolia tree was nothing now but a silhouette in flame, its white petals turning black as they fell. Sarah stared at it, her face streaked with rain and soot. "Mama's still in there." Hetty looked up, her voice breaking. "Ain't nothing left to save, baby." "But she'll be scared," Sarah whispered. "She don't like the dark." Hetty reached for her shoulders, turning her gently away from the fire. "She the one made the dark, Miss Sarah. We just living in it." The wind howled, carrying the sound of collapsing timber. For a moment, Sarah thought she heard her mother's voice, faint, carried through the rain. Not words, just that soft, trembling hum she used to make before prayers. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Hetty listened, eyes wide. "That's the house dying. Let it die." Sarah took a shaky breath, staring out at the river. It looked endless, black water stretching into nowhere. "Where are we going to go?" Hetty didn't answer right away. The rain hit the water hard, rippling light across its surface. "We follow it," she said finally. "Water always leads somewhere." Sarah's teeth chattered. "What if it don't?" "Then we keep walking till it does." Hetty pulled off her apron and wrapped it around Sarah's shoulders. "You cold?" Sarah nodded. "Good," Hetty whispered. "Cold means you still alive." For a long time they sat there, watching the fire burn itself smaller, the sky above turning black-blue, lightning splitting it like a torn seam. At last Sarah spoke again. "I used to think Mama could fix anything." Hetty looked at her, eyes soft. "Some things don't need fixing. Some things need leaving behind." Sarah turned back toward the river. "If we go in, will it wash us clean?" Hetty hesitated. "Ain't nothing wrong with you that need washing." The child didn't answer. She only watched her reflection tremble on the water's surface. A pale ghost in the dark, doubled and broken by every... Hetty took her hand. "Then breathe, Miss Sarah. Don't let her take that from you." Behind them, Rosefield's roof finally gave way with a roar that rolled across the field like thunder finding its echo. And beneath the storm, the river kept moving, steady, endless, uncaring, carrying the firelight away until only darkness remained. By morning, the storm had passed, and what remained was silence. That strange, heavy kind that follows something terrible, when even the earth seems to hold its breath. The fire at Rosefield had eaten everything it could. The house was nothing but a blackened skeleton, its brick chimneys still standing like grave markers. The magnolia tree, once so proud, had burned down to a stump, its branches curled in on themselves like fingers. Sarah stood barefoot in the wet grass, staring at the ruins. Smoke still rose in thin gray ribbons that smelled of ash and memory. Her nightdress clung to her like a second skin, stiff from the rain. Hetty stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Don't look too long," Hetty said quietly. "Ain't nothing there for you now." Sarah didn't answer. Her lips moved as though she were whispering something, but no sound came out. "You think she gone?" Hetty asked softly. Sarah nodded. "She was gone before the fire." The words came out flat and hollow. Hetty wanted to hold her, to tell her she was wrong. But she wasn't. They spent the morning by the river, washing the soot from their faces and wringing out their clothes. The water ran cloudy for a long while, carrying pieces of the plantation downstream. Wood, ash, a shred of lace that might once have been part of a curtain. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Hetty found a bit of bread May must have dropped during the escape. It was soaked and soft, but Sarah ate it anyway. "You ain't got to be strong now," Hetty said gently. "Ain't nobody watching." But Sarah didn't know how to stop. She chewed in silence, eyes fixed on the water as though something moved beneath it. "Do you think the river remembers things?" she asked. Hetty frowned. "What kind of things?" "People," Sarah said. "Voices, faces. The ones that fall in." Hetty looked out at the current, dark and steady. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it just carries what don't belong nowhere else." Sarah touched her stomach lightly, as if feeling for something inside. "Mama said what's inside us is what ruins us." Hetty turned sharply. "Don't you listen to that no more. What's inside you is yours. You hear me? Yours." Sarah nodded, but her eyes drifted back toward the smoke curling above the ruins. By noon, the sun had turned the wet fields into a haze of steam, the air shimmering with heat and ghosts. Hetty tied her scarf tighter. "We best get moving. Somebody will come soon, maybe from town." Sarah took one last look at Rosefield, its black chimneys standing like watchtowers in a graveyard. She wanted me to be perfect, she said softly. Now she can't see me at all. Hetty took her hand. Good, she whispered. Let her rest blind. And together they began walking south, toward the river's bend, where no one knew their names and the world might not care who they'd been. They followed the river for 2 days. The road was soft from rain, mud clinging to their feet as if it didn't want to let them go. At night they slept beneath the trees, wrapped in whatever dry cloth Hetty could salvage from the wreckage. She started small fires when it was safe, though every crackle made Sarah flinch. On the second night the wind changed. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, cleaner, gentler, but Sarah still woke gasping, eyes wild. Mama, she whispered, half asleep. Don't. Please don't. Hetty reached for her. Ain't nobody here, Miss Sarah. It's just us. But Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on something beyond her, something in the dark. She's watching, she said softly. She don't like that I left. Hetty took her by the shoulders, firm but tender. Your mama gone. Fire took her. Ain't nothing left but ash. Sarah stared at her, the faintest smile breaking across her cracked lips. Ash don't stay gone. It floats. A chill crawled down Hetty's spine. You just tired, that's all. But as Sarah lay back down, she kept her eyes open, watching the moonlight filter through the trees above like smoke. By morning, they'd reached a small clearing near the bend in the river. An abandoned cabin stood there, leaning, half collapsed, but still dry. Hetty eyed it with relief. This'll do for a spell. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old wood, but it was shelter. Hetty found a rusted pot, cleaned it with river water, and started a small fire in the hearth. Sarah sat in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees. You hungry? Hetty asked. Sarah shook her head. Not yet. Hetty frowned. You ain't ate since yesterday. Sarah looked up, her eyes distant. She says I don't need to. Hetty's heart clenched. Who say that? Sarah pointed toward the corner of the cabin, where a shaft of light cut through a broken board. Her. Hetty followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Only dust swirling in the air. She forced her voice steady. That ain't her. That's just light. Sarah smiled faintly. You don't hear her, do you? She's whispering. No, baby, Hetty said, reaching for her, shaking her head. Ain't no one whispering here but the wind. Sarah's expression softened. That's what she sound like now. The fire popped, sending up a small spark. Both girls flinched. Outside, the river murmured softly, low and endless, like something repeating itself over and over, trying not to forget. Hetty finally settled beside Sarah, pulling her close. You safe now, she said. Ain't nobody going to hurt you again. But as she said it, she could feel Sarah's pulse racing against her arm, too fast, too scared, as if her own heart didn't believe her. And somewhere deep in the woods, faint and carried on the wind, came the distant sound of a woman's voice, humming the same hymn Margaret Whitlock had once whispered before every meal. The days after that blurred into one another. Gray mornings, long silences, nights of half-sleep and fever dreams. The fire in the cabin never burned bright, just enough to keep them from freezing. Hetty did her best to keep Sarah fed. Berries, roots, whatever she could find. But the girl only picked at them, her hands trembling. I ain't hungry, Sarah whispered one evening. Hetty frowned, tired and thin herself. You got to eat, Miss Sarah. We walked near 2 days without much. Sarah shook her head. Mama says I've had enough. Hetty froze. Don't start that again. But Sarah only smiled, that faraway smile that didn't belong to the living. She talks to me when I'm quiet. She says she forgives me now. Hetty reached for her hand. It was cold, damp with sweat. Ain't nothing to forgive, baby. You didn't do nothing wrong. Sarah looked up, her eyes glassy and strange. She says I'm finally what she wanted me to be. Small, quiet, clean. Hetty's throat closed. You stop that talk right now. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She turned toward the sound of the river outside, the soft, rhythmic murmur that seemed to fill the whole world. I hear her out there sometimes, she said. She's in the water now. I think she wants me to come. That night, when Hetty woke to stir the fire, Sarah's corner was empty. Panic shot through her like lightning. She ran outside, the cold air hitting her lungs hard. Sarah! The moon hung low over the river, pale and swollen, and there she was, standing barefoot at the edge, her white dress glowing in the half-light, her hair whipping around her face. Sarah Ann! Hetty shouted, running toward her. Sarah turned slowly, her eyes wide but calm. She's here, Hetty. Mama's here. She says I ain't got to be hungry no more. Hetty grabbed her shoulders. That ain't her. That's just your hurt talking. Sarah's gaze flicked to the water, where the moon shimmered across the surface. Look, she whispered. Hetty followed her eyes, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw it too, two pale shapes beneath the surface, faint but clear, like reflections caught in still glass. One small, one tall, both motionless. Her breath caught. Come away, Sarah. But Sarah's expression only softened, almost peaceful. She's smiling now. Then her foot slipped on the muddy bank. Hetty screamed, lunging forward, catching the girl's wrist just as she fell. The river surged, swallowing the hem of her dress. Hold on, Hetty cried, pulling with all her strength. Sarah blinked, dazed. I don't want to be hungry anymore. Hetty yanked harder, dragging her back onto the grass. Both girls fell, soaked and shaking. For a long time they just lay there, the river rushing beside them, dark, endless, whispering its soft, cruel lullaby. Hetty pressed her forehead to Sarah's. Don't you leave me. Not like that. Sarah stared past her at the water. She ain't gone, Hetty. She's just changed places. And as thunder rumbled far away, Hetty realized the fire hadn't killed Margaret Whitlock. It had only moved her. For the next few days, Hetty didn't let Sarah out of her sight. Every time the girl's gaze wandered toward the river, she gently turned her face away. Every time she whispered her mother's name, Hetty spoke over it, humming softly the old songs her own mother used to sing to chase the bad away. But the voice that haunted Sarah couldn't be drowned out. It had sunk deeper than hearing, into her breath, her heartbeat, the quiet between thoughts. She began waking before dawn to sit by the cabin's small window, watching the fog drift off the water. She calls softer now, Sarah whispered one morning. Like she's tired, too. Hetty stirred from sleep, rubbing her eyes. Ain't no one calling, baby. You just hearing the river talk. Sarah turned her head slowly. The river sound like her. Hetty got up, crossed the room, and knelt in front of her. You listen to me, Miss Sarah. You got a choice now. You can follow what's gone, or you can stay with what's left. Sarah looked down at her hands, small, pale, trembling. What's left don't feel real. Hetty took those hands in hers, pressing them to her own chest. Then you feel this. You feel me breathing. That's real. That's the Lord's proof you still hear. For a moment, Sarah nodded. But then her eyes drifted toward the window again, unfocused, as if the world outside were whispering something only she could hear. That night, Hetty dreamed of fire. Not the burning house, but the magnolia tree, its petals catching light like tiny lanterns. In the dream, Sarah stood beneath it, smiling, her face peaceful, her dress clean. When Hetty woke, the bed beside her was empty. The cabin door hung open, the night air cold and damp. Sarah! The river was louder than before, swollen from the storm, the moon breaking itself across its surface. There, just beyond the reeds, she saw the girl standing in the shallows, her white dress clinging to her body, her hair plastered against her face. Sarah Ann. Sarah turned, her eyes glassy and distant. It's quiet here, she said. She don't sound angry no more. Come out that water. Hetty begged, stepping closer. Sarah smiled faintly. She say I can rest now. And before Hetty could reach her, the girl leaned forward, slow, gentle, as if surrendering to sleep, and slipped beneath the surface. Hetty screamed her name, plunging in after her, the cold burning through her lungs. She searched, clawed, cried out into the current, but the river was stronger, carried the child away in silence. When she finally crawled onto the bank, she collapsed in the mud, sobbing into her hands. The moonlight shimmered across the water, still and calm, almost kind. And there, for just a breath, Hetty saw two faint reflections side by side, one small, one tall, until the current broke them apart. She stayed there until morning, whispering the same words over and over. You was enough, baby. You was always enough. Years passed. The river forgot the sound of their names, but the land remembered. Rosefield Plantation never rose again. Nature took back what was hers. Vines crawling over scorched brick, grass pushing up through the cracks of the old foundation. The magnolia tree somehow grew back from its own ashes, its trunk twisted and hollow now, but every spring it bloomed again, white petals against a blackened stump, stubborn and beautiful. People from the nearby towns avoided that stretch of road. They said it was cursed, that if you stood by the ruins at dusk, you'd hear a woman's voice humming from somewhere you couldn't place. Some said it came from the tree. Others swore it came from the river. No one ever mentioned the child. Hetty lived far from that place by then. She had grown older, quieter, her hands rough from years of washing other people's clothes. But she never spoke of Rosefield, not to anyone. Some wounds don't heal when spoken. They heal only when carried. Every year, when the magnolias bloomed, she walked back to the river. She never went near the ruins, only to the water's edge, where she'd light a single candle and let it drift downstream. One evening, as the sun sank low and the water turned gold, she saw something, faint but real. Two small shapes in the reflection, standing side by side beneath the rippling surface. Sarah's face, and beside it, a woman's. Not the mistress, not the monster, but the mother she might have been if love had meant gentleness instead of control. The reflection stayed until the wind broke the water's skin, scattering them into ripples. Hetty whispered, "Rest easy, Miss Sarah," and watched the candle float until it vanished around the bend. When she turned to leave, she looked once more at the magnolia tree. The petals were falling in slow, soundless drifts, blanketing the ground like snow. She smiled then, a small, sad smile that held both grief and peace, and began the long walk home. Behind her, the river kept whispering, the same way it always had. But if you listened close enough, through the rush of the water and the hum of the wind, you might swear you could still hear a child's laughter, soft and far away, carried downstream. And when the moon rose over what was left of Rosefield, its reflection shimmered faintly on the water. Two figures standing together, hand in hand, their faces turned toward the light. They did not speak. They didn't have to, because after all the hunger, the fire, and the silence, they were finally what they'd always wanted to be: unseen, untouched, free. If you're still here, take a breath. Stories like this don't end with ghosts or curses. They end with what people leave behind, the quiet horrors that linger long after the house is gone, and the echoes of those who were never meant to be remembered. Some say on still nights, you can hear the river sing beneath the magnolia tree. A soft hum, like a mother's lullaby or a child's prayer. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe it's what's left of them. Two souls who learned too late that love can wound deeper than cruelty ever could. Before you go, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Because somewhere, not too far from here, another story like this one is still waiting to be told.